Ever feel like America, I don't know, is kind of stuck? Like, obsessed with the future, but still holding on to the past?
Yeah, I see what you mean.
Well, we're diving into G.K. Chesterton's What I Saw in America to unpack that.
Chesterton. Always a good read, even if it's from, almost 100 years ago.
Exactly. And it's not just some travel diary. He's dissecting American identity with that British wit of his.
Yeah, he had a knack for seeing right through things, didn't he?
He did. So we've got some excerpts. Think of it as, like, time traveling to the Roaring '20s. See what made America tick back then.
And maybe, just maybe, we'll see ourselves a little differently along the way.
Right. Now, one thing that struck me was how Chesterton tackles this whole idea of America as the young nation.
It's fascinating, isn't it? He's almost amused by it, like he sees right through that label.
Yeah. So why do you think that is? What's he getting at?
Well, he's pointing out that America's history is way more complicated than just being young, right? And you can almost see it even today.
Oh, absolutely. We're obsessed with the latest tech, newest skyscrapers, but then
there are these traditions, these social structures that haven't budged an inch.
Exactly. Like that saying, the more things change, the more they stay the same.
Right. And Chesterton picks up on that. He even talks about the contrast between America's technological leaps and its social progress, especially on race.
That's a really good point.
He points to things like, the South's reliance on black labor. This system, rooted in the past, totally at odds with the image of America as this progressive, forward-thinking nation.
It's like he's saying, you can't just slap a young sticker on and ignore everything underneath.
Exactly. It's about looking beyond the surface.
Okay, so we've got this young nation grappling with some pretty old problems. And speaking of contradictions, what about plutocracy?
Yeah, he definitely picks up on that tension between America's ideals of equality and, the power of the wealthy.
Right. But before we get into it, maybe give us a little Plutocracy 101. What is it exactly?
Sure. Basically, it's when wealth equals power. And Chesterton sees this constant push and pull in America, this desire for a level playing field, but then, bam, money talks.
Right, and he uses some really interesting examples. Like he talks about the portrayal of millionaires in American crime fiction.
Oh, that's a great one. He notices how the millionaire is this stock character.
And usually a criminal one, right?
Exactly. It suggests this awareness of a criminal class at the top.
So, even back then, there was this sense that maybe great wealth, especially if you made it yourself, came with a darker side.
Yeah, there's this suspicion, this potential for corruption tied to wealth that he observed.
And you contrast that with how England viewed wealth at the time, right?
Yeah, he argues there was less automatic suspicion there, less focus on the potential for the wealthy to be corrupt.
Interesting. So different cultures, different views on money and power. And, speaking of power and corruption, he dives into the trial of Senator Hayman in Oklahoma.
Ah, yes, the Hayman trial. He uses that to really show how America views wealth and power, especially when someone breaks the rules.
Because Hayman was this wealthy senator accused of some pretty serious stuff, right?
Exactly. And what's fascinating is how his wealth was actually used against him in court.
So being a millionaire wasn't exactly a get-out-of-jail-free card.
Not at all. It was almost like a strike against him. And Chesterton links this back to that American democratic spirit.
That distrust of concentrated wealth and power.
Exactly. It's like even if it's just in the courtroom, the scales of justice are supposed to balance out those inequalities.
I see. So celebrate success, but keep it in check.
Yeah.
And, speaking of keeping things in check, we can't forget about prohibition.
Right, and Chesterton was pretty sharp about that whole era, too. He saw right through some of the moral arguments used to justify it.
He didn't buy the whole "it's for the good of society" line.
Well, he argues that prohibition was heavily influenced by powerful industrialists who saw it as a way to control workers.
Oh, wow. So they were using a moral argument to mask their own interests. Talk about sneaky.
Exactly. He points out how it was initially about controlling black laborers, but then, boom, it expands to all workers. It becomes this tool for the powerful, all under the guise of morality.
It makes you wonder, how many times has that playbook been used throughout history?
Right. It's amazing how relevant his observations from almost a century ago still feel today.
Absolutely. And it's not just the big stuff. Even his observations about American slang. It's like he's commenting on our habits today.
Oh, tell me about it. He has this bit where he compares American and English slang, and he's like, we already have plenty of words for that. Thank you very much.
Yeah, like we don't need to reinvent the wheel. I remember he uses the example, up to you.
Right, as if it is for you wasn't good enough.
Exactly. He's poking fun at this need to be new, to adopt phrases without even thinking about them, which, I'll admit, I've totally done.
Haven't we all? And that's what makes him such a good observer. He picks up on those little things, those quirks of language or behavior, and uses them to say something bitter.
It's about looking beyond the surface, right?
Yes. And with the slang, he even compares it to blind imitation. And this is where he makes a really important point about international relations, which we'll get into more later.
Ooh, a cliffhanger. But I think I know where you're going with this. He talks about how real understanding doesn't come from trying to be the same.
You got it.
Yeah.
It's about appreciating what makes us different, those unique cultural things, not erasing them for some bland global culture.
Which feels even more relevant in today's world. But we'll save that for later. It's like he's saying, hey, let's celebrate those differences instead of trying to iron them out.
Yeah, exactly.
And this whole idea of respecting different perspectives.
Yeah.
It comes up when he talks about how America and England deal with people who, break the rules. Especially the wealthy ones.
Oh, absolutely. He makes this really interesting point about how both countries kind of have these, laws that seem universal but are really designed to control certain groups.
Oh, I see what you mean.
But what he finds fascinating is the difference in how they're actually enforced, especially when it comes to the wealthy. Like, he suggests that Americans are way more likely to just, disregard those laws if they're inconvenient.
Yeah. It's like that American spirit, right? That you can't tell me what to do attitude. Yeah. He even says something about Americans being willing to shed blood for a beer, which,
it's a bit much, right?
A bit extreme.
Yeah.
But it speaks to that independent, maybe even rebellious streak he observes in Americans.
Totally. Remember, he's writing during Prohibition, so that rebellious spirit was probably running pretty high.
That's true.
But it connects to a broader point he makes about this potential for violence that he senses in America.
Huh. Interesting.
It's like that same Wild West energy, that readiness to challenge authority if pushed too far.
I get it. So it's not just about breaking rules for fun. It's about that deeper resistance to being controlled.
Right, exactly. He even compares it to figures like, William Cobbett in England, who challenged the establishment and really fought for the common man.
So it's like he's saying that America still has that revolutionary spirit, that willingness to fight for what they believe in.
Even if it means going against the grain.
Exactly. It makes you think about how that spirit is playing out today, What forms is it taking?
Definitely something to ponder. And it kind of ties into another fascinating paradox he observes about America. This ability to be, incredibly childlike and surprisingly sophisticated at the same time.
Whoa, hold on. How can a nation be both? Those seem like total opposites.
Right. But he argues that Americans have this remarkable capacity for, spontaneous social organization.
Like what? Give me an example.
Think about it. They just create clubs, leagues, communities with this almost childlike enthusiasm. It's like that pure joy kids have when they make their own little societies, with their own rules and rituals.
Oh, okay, I see it. That sense of playfulness, building something new together. So that's the childlike part.
Exactly. And then, at the same time, they're capable of this incredible intellectual depth, especially in things like technology and innovation.
Right. They're always pushing boundaries, inventing something new.
Exactly. He sees it in their inventions, their architecture, even their way of problem solving.
So it's like this blend of youthful energy and this mature ingenuity that he finds so captivating.
Precisely. And it all circles back to his critique of internationalism, this idea that we shouldn't strive to be this bland, homogenous world.
Because real understanding comes from appreciating those unique qualities, those differences, right?
Yes. He's not saying ignore the bad, but we should be able to laugh at those quirks, even poke fun at each other. Yeah. He uses this great phrase, a harmony of humors, to describe it.
A harmony of humors. I love that.
Right. It's about finding that common ground through our differences, not in spite of them. And he even suggests that this kind of playful teasing, this ability to laugh at ourselves and each other, it can actually be a form of friendship.
It's like that saying, I dish it out because I can take it. It's a sign of trust.
Exactly. It shows you're comfortable enough to be yourself, quirks and all. And he connects this back to his 2 walking sticks observation, remember?
Oh, right. It's about understanding the different meanings those sticks hold in each culture.
And by understanding those different meanings, we can start to bridge the gap,
It's about finding those points of connection, even when they come from unexpected places. But, it's not all fun and games with Chesterton. He also tackles some pretty serious stuff about American culture, like this idea of a criminal class at the top. It feels like he sees that as this fundamental tension in the American story.
You're right. He keeps coming back to this contrast between America's, almost reverence for figures like Abraham Lincoln.
Because Lincoln embodies that American dream.
Yeah.
Right? The self-made man.
Exactly. He represents that ideal of American democracy. But at the same time, Chesterton also sees this other side, this undercurrent of lawlessness, especially among the wealthy.
He sees it in those crime stories and the cynical jokes, even in how he thinks wealthy industrialists use prohibition for their own gain.
Exactly. And he's worried that this unchecked wealth and power in the hands of a few, it could undermine the very principles America was built on.
It's like he's worried that America might be on a path that leads to, well, not a good place.
Yeah. And it's interesting, right? Because he connects this back to another paradox he keeps highlighting, this obsession with progress while also being kind of haunted by the past.
Yeah.
He argues that Americans like to say they have no history, but they actually do have a history, a very specific kind. It's just preserved differently.
It's like he compares it to Pompeii, right?
Yeah.
That Roman city frozen in time by the volcano.
Exactly. He says America has its own Pompeii.
Right.
The legacy of slavery. It's this thing that's morally distant, but still casts a shadow on the present,
Yeah.
And he suggests that it's something America hasn't fully reckoned with yet.
It's like you can't just keep building the newest, shiniest thing while ignoring what's underneath it all.
Exactly. To move forward, you have to deal with the tough stuff from the past. And honestly, that's probably good advice for everyone, not just America.
Totally. It's about looking in the mirror, owning up to the good and the bad.
And, he connects this back to his whole point about international understanding, too. He says nations, just like people, can't really understand themselves or each other without acknowledging their flaws, their mistakes.
We can't just sweep the bad stuff under the rug.
Right. He even says that's where true humor comes from, being able to laugh at yourself, at the absurdity of it all.
So it's about embracing that complexity, right?
Yeah.
Nations, people, we're all full of contradictions.
Exactly. We've got our good qualities, our bad qualities, and it's about seeing the whole picture. And he argues that this kind of honesty, being willing to be self-critical, that's essential for building real relationships.
It makes sense. We connect more when we're being real with each other.
Exactly. And that means moving beyond those simple labels like young nation and really grappling with what makes each culture unique.
We need to go deeper than the stereotypes. And, it's like he's saying that history matters, right? It shapes who we are today.
Absolutely. And he even suggests that America's history, even with all its flaws, can actually teach us something.
What do you mean?
Well, he points out that even though it's a relatively young nation, America's already faced some really big universal issues. Freedom, equality, power, ambition. He's saying that by looking at how America's handled those things, the successes, the failures, it gives us insight into the human condition as a whole.
It's like America is this giant social experiment.
Yeah.
And the whole world's watching to see what works, what doesn't.
Exactly. And by paying attention, we can learn from both the triumphs and the mistakes.
It's about taking those lessons and applying them to our own lives, our own societies. And that's what's so great about this book, What I Saw in America. It's not just Chesterton cracking jokes about Americans.
Right. He's going deeper than that.
He's making us think about human nature, about what it means to build a just society, about how we understand each other in a world that's constantly changing. So as we wrap up our deep dive into Chesterton's America, I think the takeaway is this. Don't shy away from those tough questions. Embrace the complexity, find the humor in it all, and never stop questioning, learning, and growing. Because in the end, it's those differences, those quirks, those unique perspectives that make life and the world a much more interesting place.